Episode 28 of The Passive Hang. Welcome back, guys. It's Phaon here, and if you haven't already, check out thepassivehang.com, where I'm building it up to be a library of movement resources for all you enthusiasts out there. I've started with the locomotion practice, but there's more to come. Check it out now, thepassivehang.com. Thanks, guys, once again for tuning in. This is another episode of The Passive Hang. I think we're up to episode 28 now, and I have Jason Round on the podcast, who is a teacher residing in Bern, Switzerland. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thank you much for having me, Phaon.
And, yeah, I've been following your teaching and what you share on various platforms, Instagram, your blog, and YouTube for a while. I've really enjoyed that. So yeah, keen to get sort of stuck in with some of the concepts that you share. But maybe I'd love to hear just personally, like, how's your practice sort of developed over the years? Maybe if you can take us through that journey from, I'm sure it's a quite a wide and extensive journey, but how it's sort of roughly gone high level from when you first started getting into more of this movement based approach to where you are now.
Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily say it's quite extensive, in all honesty. I mean, I think that any practitioner that ultimately starts bringing themselves towards this idea of movement and starts to explore this idea in relation to their physical practice, whatever their history of physical practice is, it's always going to be informed in a way of what they've done before. And that can be, via negativa as well. So for example, if someone has been, let's say, weightlifting a lot in their history, and then at some point it kind of hit a wall and it was like, I can't, for maybe it's injury reasons, or maybe it's just, they just have no motivation in that anymore. They might completely change their practice in relation to, this idea of a movement perspective. But for myself, in all honesty, it started off as more of an extension, more of a widening, to sound a bit pretentious about it, this idea of the overspilling, it kind of like spilt out into it very, with very welcomed, to have a new opportunity and a new space to explore. So originally I came myself from a type of classical young teenage dude's bodybuilding background, man. I mean, that's, I've mentioned this in other places, and I even kind of wrote it down just to, I found that a lot of other people were coming with similar stories, and they were saying, I feel like it was the same thing for me. So I thought it would be nice, because I'm also quite very a fan of writing and expressing kind of ideas, whether that's through storytelling, whether that's through just reflection. I presented something on the website as well that also kind of details these things for people who are actually interested in reading through that. But it basically starts off like this. A young guy finding himself in Australia after having practiced, bodybuilding practice over a numerous period of years, like 5 or 10 years. And then finding at some point that there were things that other people were doing that looked pretty cool and interesting, and they seemed to involve the subjects that I was, in as well. For example, like strength. And then I would try these simple types of body weight movements, and then it was a failure, absolute failure, to the point of personal shock and towards horror. And so I use this idea of, my inner child essentially cried. And I don't mean this in the sense of just like, oh, I feel so terrible, I'm just crying like a child. I mean in the sense of, I believe that many children, when they're younger, have this, it's not necessarily a feeling of invincibility, because you are not so familiar with the idea of vulnerability. You just feel, we used to just jump off things and do backflips off stuff. I used to pile drive my brother into metal plates. We used to hit each other with chairs and things like this. You feel indestructible. And then I went to jump on my hands to do what some of these other people were doing. And the wrists crumbled, the shoulders crumbled. I had pain, and it was not a nice feeling. And there's two directions you can go with that. You can retreat back into your practice and dedicate yourself to that specific practice, which would have been perfectly fine as well. To a certain point in the way that I was going, or you can start to embrace this idea of, okay, what's in that box? What's in that box that I'm missing? What are the pieces that I don't have? And in the beginning, you start to think, oh yeah. So we're talking about when I first then started transitioning into more of a calisthenics and body weight training type of perspective, because it was the easiest thing for me. I was involved with strength and strength, calisthenics. These guys are big as well. Yeah, I can get ripped and also, do all these cool movements as well. I just have to figure out what to do on leg day. And in any case, I started pursuing this particular avenue. From then, spending 2 or 3 years with calisthenics, I was also at that point living in Prague, and then I found that there was a calisthenics culture there. So it was the first time, I'm sure in Australia they've been there for a very long time, but in England, where I live, and specifically in the southwest, more of a kind of a countryside type place, you're going to be really hard pressed to find things like bars or things like that outside. Like even when I was living in Korea, like every school has monkey bars and bars for the children and stuff to play on. That culture just wasn't there in the southwest of England. So moving to Czech Republic, I was able to, have a small kind of culture of people. You visit the calisthenics park and people you hang out with, and you do these types of movements. After 2 or 3 years of this, the same feeling returned, that there was more. I was still just practicing specific movements, and that was the entirety of my practice. The practice was, it was satiating my thirst to practice. I was practicing more. But it was just practicing more because I was not very good at these movements. I'd never really done them before, but they were completely isolated contexts. I didn't have an understanding or an expanded vision of actually moving, which I have my own ideas of what this actually means in regards to movements at this point in time. But for years, I had to constantly repeat this question: what is difference? What does it actually mean, to move? And again, not in a pretentious way, but I just like this phrase as a friend who we used to have these kind of university pseudo-philosophical conversations and things over cigarettes and whiskeys. But he would call it the higher math. It was like, okay, it's like a logic here, and then it's like, oh, you're talking about like that idea. Okay, yeah, that's a bit different. It's like another layer. And it's always important to remember that another layer or another perspective, doesn't mean better. This is better than that. It's it's not even there. It's turning the head, taking a step to the side and going, oh, and it's very nice. It's because over the past couple of years, I've been not intensively, but taking systemic classes, and my teacher, one of the perspectives is always, it's like, where is the opportunity? When you run out of opportunities from this landscape here, change your perspective, take one step from the side, and now they have all these different types of opportunities. So taking this step to the side, and then I started seeing things, for example, of course, huge influence from Ido Portal, I think, for many people in what I would call the modern movement culture. He's, of course, been a huge figure and a huge positive influence on many. And working with some of these movements he presented, of course, through his blogs, through the various other avenues that he presented his ideas and information, from getting stuck over into those things, that was, an opening, a widening of my perspective, but it was still restricted to the physical realm of movements. And this continued for many years. It still does in many cases, but I like to think that when I am kind of pursuing specific movements, I do so consciously now. And I allocate that time and say, no, I want to perhaps learn this movement, or I want to involve myself in this discipline more, or I want to work on this particular project. Whereas previously it was kind of like, people say, well, what is it that you do? And then I always find that if your answer is, yeah, I do kind of a bit of this and I do a bit of that, there is more juice to be pulled out and more development that can come of the perspective. But I think this is always going to be the case. So for me, that's essentially how I came from practicing with bodybuilding through a transition into calisthenics, through calisthenics, actually just bringing a bit more awareness of proprioception of my body in space, but nothing like a dancer, probably nothing like a martial artist. These huge movement aspects are really still lacking in my personal practice, in all honesty. But it did then start me, rather than just, essentially object manipulation, but weighted object manipulation, a practice of this, to then a practice of moving the body in space to an extent. Moving on from that, that's essentially, that's why I say, my practice isn't necessarily wide and far reaching. I'm kind of still working on this idea of just moving the body through space, and this is definitely keeping me occupied at the moment.
Awesome. And say someone walked past you in the park, right, and you're doing something, of your practice, and they were like, "Hey, that looks interesting. What are you doing?" What's the answer at the moment?
I'm actually now, there were times where I tried to explain the idea of what it is, but now when people ask that, I'm very specific on the subject of what I'm doing at that time. Because this is the answer to the question, right? No one asked me, what is your philosophy on movement practice? They asked me, what are you doing right now? So very often it can come out in the case of working on some spinal work, because this still looks very weird to many people. I'm convinced it will become more normal in the future. But I will just say, yeah, I'm working on a practice of the spine. I'm perhaps, I'm mixing up the idea of a down up wave with something else, or I'm improvising, I'm taking impulse from the floor, I'm leading with my shoulder, and I'm just working this. And normally the next question, if they continue to venture further, bravely, then they might say, okay, what's the use of this? And then I will expand from that point. I try not to take the standpoint of starting to present the whole ideas and philosophy of something that, in all honesty, is never going to be fixed. What's the point of me laying down my philosophy or ideas or perspectives for you when you're just a passerby? And if it's the case that we're practicing together and then they want me to show some things, I will again try to be minimal in what I share. And then people might then start to dig a little bit deeper and ask, which does happen, more so at social gatherings actually than training in the park. People might venture deeper and get interested. And then if I think, okay, this person is quite genuinely interested, I'll share perhaps what might be some of the more, for want of the word abstract, I mean more of the parts are actually more disassociated to physical practice as well. Because I've said this many times and I still stand by it. I constantly, check back on my own kind of like mini dogmas. And this is one I always check back on. And I'm like, this one stands firm, which is that, if movement practice, this idea for me, if movement practice is synonymous with physical practice, like I'm out. It's not enough. Like, I don't want this idea of a movement practice for me just to be about whether it's physical practice to develop, attributes, strength and ability and balance and things like this, or whether that physical practice extends into like dance practice, martial arts practice, or things like this. I don't want that to be the culmination of my movement practice. It's not enough. There's too many other things in life that are very, very important that equally deserve that limited time to spend that time on. For example, learning German. Yeah, I'm in Swiss German. I'm in a German speaking place. This is very important for my social interaction. It is neglected. I'm taking only like 10 minutes per morning, 15 minutes per morning. But for example, if I use this space instead to do some morning practice, which the whole of the last year I was doing extensively, the scales of the balance and what I see as my general movement practice start to become unfavorable in certain places. But again, the priorities do change over time. But yeah, so for me, my physical practice and all the other things around it is what's in balance. It's not just the physical aspect. It's whatever I choose to incorporate into that practice at the same time. And this is very often something I try to share with the people who work more closely with me through things like online support. I try to share this perspective of, the greater movement practice. So when it inevitably comes to things such as, I'm taking, for example, the people I work with in Australia, I'm taking a week to go out into the bush, and they're worrying about their programming. I'm like, man, forget it. Be outside in the bush. This is what you need right now. If you really want to, just do some of the prehab stuff and patterning stuff from your practice, but like, don't hold and tie yourself to it, because I hope that your movement practice, like I see mine, is something bigger than just what's written on this piece of paper.
Yeah. How can you like uncouple, I guess, the mind and expand it to this more, this wider perspective? Like I like how you're describing it, because there's always this concept of transferability, right? And how I'm sort of seeing this is when a practice becomes more than that, like that specific area of practice, right? And it's probably not just confined to movement practice, right? But maybe if you're a potter and, you always say like the wise potter and he can speak all sorts of life lessons, right? He might be seeing it in this sort of same way. So do you think that this is a quality that naturally sort of came to you, or that you cultivated, or it was potentially like a guidance from a teacher that got you to then ask yourself these questions to be like, okay, I'm more than just developing my body?
I think any naturally inquisitive mind, I wouldn't say, completely inclined towards this way or type of thinking. I think anyone who continues to ask questions of themselves will ultimately expand their perspective on whatever it is that they're dealing with. It's not a necessity. In some cases, it's a neurosis. In some cases, it can turn completely back on you, and it can come to the extent of even anxiety. To continually question yourself, to end up to the point of double guessing. This is the practice, in my opinion. This is also hugely the practice. I see this again in some of the people I work with. In some cases, they will, message me almost in a distraught sense, because the way that they're practicing is not in harmony with actually how they lead the rest of their life, and it makes them question things. And there can be the point where that questioning just like, oh fuck, what have I done? Like, this is like, no. It's like your practice is now to try and console this piece by piece. How, the rest of your life, whether that's kind of the setup of your household, for example, and what furniture and things you have, to how you connect with, other people in your social circles and for family circles. That's, of course, this is a personal thing, but it can, stretch to that extent. And I think that transferability, as you mentioned, is definitely something that is, it's a nice word to use, because this also works on the physiological level too. So when I am, for example, developing a physical practice for someone. For example, there's a type of programming I refer to as movement practice, but I don't mean it's like your movement practice as a whole. The idea is that this programming has been developed with my perspective on the extent of my knowledge of what will give you most transferability if you're then looking at other types of practices. If you want to delve into martial arts, if you then want to move into, if you have a sporting practice, if you want to dance, I hope that this type of practice will give them that transferability. But most definitely, the characteristics and the qualities must also be transferable, as well as the attributes being these, the strength, mobility, blah, blah, blah. They are equally as important. And you can see, for example, when someone sends me videos or something like this, I can see when the qualities are absent. The mindfulness in the movement is absent. When mindfulness and movement is absent in your physical practice, it's most certainly going to be absent in your daily life. And in your daily life, quote unquote, daily life. For me, this is also, there's so much you can do in that quote unquote daily life with mindfulness that will contribute to yourself as a whole being, so I think, this idea of transferability is something that, in all honesty, the profundity of it kind of came around with the classic Arnold Schwarzenegger and his practice, and then what he ultimately called moving forward the blueprint. He called it the blueprint. It's like an interesting video on YouTube you can see called The Blueprint with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And it was essentially the way that he practiced, and also his psychology through his bodybuilding practice and competition, was essentially the blueprint of what everything else he did in his future life, through his acting career, through his political career, in his social circles, in his business ventures. It doesn't mean that, you know, a movement practice, in all honesty, I don't think will necessarily give you many transferable attributes to being a fantastic businessman. It's like, so, you know, bodybuilding might be more conducive to this, with the competition and kind of the stringent type of training and practice, and the step-by-step incremental, you know, the very focus on this. Whereas a movement practice for me, because I believe it should say should, but I will just present that as my perspective at the moment. It should endeavor to be kind of more lateral. There will be projects which of course must be linear if you want to make progress in them and to develop further knowledge and compounding knowledge and experience on that. But of course, if it's lateral, then the characteristics and the qualities then become more general. You know, things like patience. I mean, how can you overdevelop patience? This is always something that we can practice in all aspects of our life. And the context of a physical practice, based on the idea that you're working quite laterally, you're always going to be encountering something new. And with many different projects, you're always not necessarily going to move as quickly as someone who is dedicated to one area of practice. So of course, the patience must be huge. You have to develop this on a day-to-day basis. The ambition is something which comes in hand with the idea of being able to let go. If you know you want this one thing so bad, whether it's one arm handstand or one arm pull up or whatever the fashionable strength stuff is at the moment, at some point, if you want to maintain also an explorative lateral practice, you have to kind of soften that focus on it, and that can be very, very difficult for someone, especially if they come historically from a competitive background. Well, someone who's been working with me quite recently, a younger guy, you know, messaged me, and I for all the people who are in the program, I have a series called Perspectives. I might open it publicly one day, but the Perspectives essentially just shares my perspectives on what we might call a movement practice, you know, which involves these ideas of, you know, patience, de-ambition, frustration management, all these like valuable qualities that you can develop through the practice. You know, one of them is this kind of idea of focus in the moment, and, you know, soften your focus on what's further away until it's, you know, vitally important for you to look at it. And he messaged me and he said, you know, I know it's, you know, really important. We try to focus on the moment and things like this, but I think I tend to focus on the moment better when I can see something like more specifically in the future and how long it will take. And it's like, I ended up consequently sharing him, okay, quite practically, how long this hypothetical scenario that he presented to me was, which was quite a funny one. And I presented it, and the answer for mine was quite clearly 10 years. 10 years.
How did you respond?
Yeah, it was quite blank after that, but it was kind of acceptance, but it was always, normally it's always the same. Yeah, I thought that would be the case. So it's the things that are already known, and this is quite a part of how I see my function when I work with people, is to, you know, the classic, I don't call myself a facilitator, but to help facilitate a certain transition that does generally happen to most people when they start exploring more lateral physical practice. It completely affects your psychology, of course. It completely affects you. I mean, we know this, even if we want to look on a, you know, a physiological level in terms of the case of neuroplasticity in relation to physical movement. It's been done, it's been said, it's clear. So people do have these kind of things that start popping in the head, and they, you know, do struggle, just as I most definitely struggle and still continue to struggle to this day with this growing perspective of what it actually means then if you are de-ambitioning, if you are opening yourself more widely and exploring different places, if you are trying to become more adaptable in your practice, if you are embracing change, what does that mean then for the rest of my life? I mean, these are hugely important qualities. For me, one of the most fundamental perspectives of movement, again, just my own perspective, is that movement is the underlying condition of everything. Punct. That's it. It's the underlying condition of everything. Like everything is involved or in relation to movement. You can reflect and incorporate and take influence from philosophies, like Tao. For example, with Tao, change. What is the underlying context of change? Change is movement from one condition to another condition. The underlying condition is movement. So in the idea, if we cannot let go, if we do not, it cannot develop these qualities to de-ambition and blah, 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 and all the rest of it and be adaptable, you are effectively blocking change. You're blocking movement. And normally on whatever, level it comes on, spiritual, emotional, physical, when you block movement, normally bad things start to happen either further down the line or, even in that point in time. So for me, I try to, as well as construct, just on paper, I always tell people this. Look, what you've got digital writing in a PDF paper. That's it. Nothing else. You have to make something of that now. I will support you along the way. The changes that come and help you with, I will point in directions and hope to cultivate a certain perspective for you without trying to be overbearing on it. But I will also put my perspective forward because you've joined on board now. So, this is something that for me is hugely important, to bring that perspective forward with the physical practice. And then also when people do have the kind of qualms along the way, how long does it take? There were times when I would have just said things like, it takes as long as it needs and it needs as long as it takes. Punct. Yeah. And this is the kind of like overwrite the easy copy and paste and like, oh yeah, it takes as long as it needs, as long as. But I mean, to be human about it, you're dealing with someone who has come to you for a specific reason. On the base ground of it is they're asking for help. And I am offering help in this particular area. So I try to be helpful. Some cases I might just be like, if it's really something like, come on, we said that before, I might just copy and paste something I said before just to make the point of, hey, look, we've been through this. But especially if it's a younger person, I will, I'll be practical, but I'll be realistic. If you want to do, a dragon squat until your shoulder touches the floor and come back up, and do a sissy squat with no knees touching the floor till your heels touch your ass and come back up. And you can't even sit in a resting squat at the moment. You can't even go without body weight, hips below parallel. It's 10 years, man. Like it's 10 years. Like unless you only want to do those things and those movements, I said, this is some video I put on YouTube. These movements, they're not useful. They're not even movements I would prescribe to anyone for training. It was just a demonstration. It's just a piece, a showpiece of, through the physical practice that I've personally been doing, this is what it has allowed me to do. And there's these couple movements that represented certain aspects of lower body complexity. It's really, really minimal. And he used this as an example. And so I said, so for me, I just first ever visited the pistol squat in like 2000 and the video. This is why I remember dates, because I have all of my physical practice recorded, like 2012. And then I did that movement and filmed it in 2019. That's 7 years. I came into contact with the sissy squat. I came into contact with the sissy squat from Dave Draper, actually, the old bodybuilder. But much later, when I started practicing it in 2016, and then by the time, 2015, by the time again I filmed that movement, it was 4 years later. So it was realistic to say 10 years to this guy. And and I tried to do it without like, it'll take you 10 years to get to the point to possibly do that. It was like, no, like the idea I'm trying to say is, are you in your practice for the long run? You don't have to answer this question now. But if this really is a desire of yours to ultimately have the physiological capability to perform those types of movements, it's your journey. It will be an ongoing journey. And by that time, when you're able to do that, you won't have these questions anymore.
A lot to unpack there, which I
Yeah,
really,
sorry,
really
I
love.
told you already that you get me rolling and gonna, yeah.
um, Maybe one to start on is still continuing on from this transferability, and you've talked about lateral exploration and preparing the body to be able to enter into various sort of disciplines and on a wider approach. I see on your website as well that you have like a program which is named like elements. So that sort of gets me thinking about like this almost like foundational approach maybe to preparing the body. If that is the case, like what is foundational? How do you program like the elements of movement?
Yeah. So in ideas of foundational, it's not foundational. But I mean, if it's necessary, bring that back up again, because there's stuff to say on this idea of foundational that I might be able to share some of my ideas of what I think, if it's possible, would be foundational for movement practice. So you can come back to that. What the elements actually means, it could have quite have easily been called aspects, but I felt this is kind of, it's like, I have to put something on a website. And I just connected with a guy who was from Switzerland, and he was like an online marketer, but also interested in movement. I was helping him with some shoulder stuff. I mean, when people just message me about odd things like this, or is there something, I send free videos and even some small programming. And then he was like, okay, bro, like you've helped me so much. I'm going to help you sort out your website and your online marketing and things. I was like, okay. And I sat down with him and I was like, nah, actually, yeah, this guy kind of like, of course, it's his practice. He knows some stuff and is useful. Now looking at my old website now, I'm like, yeah, shit, this is like, doesn't really represent what I do at all in any way. But so I had to have something that was a bit more, connecting with people rather than like movement aspects. But elements, this is why I also put this very useful, jigsaw emoji. So the elements is like pieces of a jigsaw. There's no complete jigsaw. There's no complete picture. You just add the bits and put it wherever you want. But the elements is the idea that I had this perspective that, so I can only take so many people in online coaching. First of all, to be able to deliver a one-to-one experience in the way that I want to work with someone one-to-one. But then also the workload. Yeah, I'm not the kind of guy that likes to fill up his day with work all the time. I like to practice as much as I can. And there's many other things that might distract me from practice without then increasing my workload. So then there are other people that also wanted to work with me. So it made sense that, okay, like if everything I do with people on the online support platform is completely individualized for that person and their program develops with them as they develop, if I consider myself someone who has valuable things to share with people of all levels of practice, no matter what their background, I should be able to produce a basic program that will help people move towards what this idea that I have, of which is, developing your general movement potential, of, how it is in my mind. So, for example, the time of Corona and the pandemic was a perfect launch pad for that. In terms of people being at home, I now had a context that was applicable to many people. There's many people who have to stay at home. I had also just come from Barcelona, so I started getting more of a connection and following from people based in Spain, and they had really, really bad lockdown. They were in Barcelona, they were inside for 6 weeks, children not able to go outside of the house. And people were already asking for things, in the initial instance. And I thought, okay, this would be a perfect situation to release the first of the programs of what I would call elements. So this element, the first one, was the elements of which is just your daily practice. So daily practice is kind of like expanded movement snacks, in the way that it's a practice that you can do every single day and you're not going to kill yourself. If you wanted to do it every day for 40 minutes, you could. But likewise, it's perfectly possible to do 2 or 3 times a week and adjust the program for just 20 minutes. This is what I want to present, something accessible for everyone, to open the perspective of the physical practice through movement culture, but for everyone. I mean, maybe you found yourself, but I know certain other people have, is for all the benefits that movement culture can bring on a physiological level, and of course then influencing everything else, the entire soma, etc., it's not very accessible. It's not accessible. Like, and in some cases, it's even made not to be accessible for people who, you know, work more from this perspective. Again, that's like completely, you know, this is your perspective. There's no, this is CrossFit and this is how you do it, and then you just pay a certain amount per month and you can put movement culture on there. It's more, for me, the idea that everyone is contributing to an idea. Whether some people like it or not, it's always going to be a collaborative affair now. It's become open source. Like, this is why I also made this thing on YouTube called Open Resources, to support this idea of, you know, open source. So this is where the first elements came from. I started with that. The idea was there years, about at least a year before, when I actually had the first, before I had the first kind of meeting with my friend who helped me with website stuff and all that, which became a part of my practice. Oh God. Yeah, I worked that one out after a bit, but site crashed a few times, it broke completely. Yeah, so the elements I then continued to build from there. And the one that I've been working on, which was supposed to be kind of more the first one I was working on for years, was this elements for breathing and diaphragm. I kind of bit off more than I could chew with that one, because sometimes I'm susceptible to my own tendency, as you may hear. I kind of like to speak and given the opportunity to do so. And it's the same with writing. It was always, when I had a supervisor with relation to my writing, it was always like, okay, stop writing, and what you have, make something with it. So the elements was then another aspect, breathing and diaphragm, which is an aspect of movement. Again, I use this term elements instead. And then, for example, the idea now is like a little bit more general. So, for example, I created programming for sedentary workers because of the fact that at this point in time, I was up to 10 hours straight on the laptop working with only just wiggling around. And then thank God I had my hour or two practice in the morning, because I couldn't, you know, do a full practice that day, but I could get an hour or two in the morning, and then like 10 hours straight on the laptop. And I was feeling it, but I was just involved in a different practice at that time. I was doing a lot of work with other people and things and on the laptop. And it was like, man, and I'd worked in offices and things before for years. I was like, a physical practice for people who are sedentary. I think Katie Bowman spoke about this recently, or in some podcast I picked up, and she was essentially saying that her area of interest was going into the biomechanics of sedentary people, because most people are sedentary. This is more reflective of the population today. So it would make more sense to target her studies towards and investigations towards the effects of, not just the effects, but I mean, what does the sedentary physiology look like? So for me, I thought, well, yeah, I mean, can I use this idea, the context, the movement context of being sedentary, to then create a type of programming that would be beneficial for regaining and developing ranges and working on some fundamental things such as some basic strength and mechanics, pushing, pulling mechanics and stuff like this. And then it kind of built from there. So the elements is the idea of these kind of movement aspects, but it now is, you know, expanding. I don't have a list of things that I'm going to do. I've got one other program in mind that I do want to produce, and then we'll see how it moves forward from there.
So what does that actually look like? You mentioned, you know, there's some pulling, pushing, like what, in the elements, the practical tools, maybe if you could sort of share, like what would people expect, you know, for this sedentary worker, which I agree with you, like for a lot of people, it's like vastly different to maybe like, you know, for us practitioners, or even when you're starting in on your practitioner journey, you're already like way past this sedentary level, right? So yeah, what do you try to share for these type of people?
Well, I mean, first of all, as I mentioned previously, when I was working with object manipulation with weight training and things like this, and then moving into just moving my body through space, essentially body weight work, I learned so much from this about the mechanics of how I can move my body, how I can support my body, how I can manipulate it through space, certain mechanics of, you know, different ways I can pull or push and things like this, that a lot of the programming, therefore, that I provide is body weight related. This is also due to accessibility. So in the programming, the minimal thing you need is like a pull-up bar and tennis balls. And this is still limited in itself. So for example, there can be cases that if you're working on vertical pulling development, so essentially the context of the pull-up or the chin-up or whichever kind of variation they're working with, that you may just be working with scapular work for a very long time. It would be ideal if there was something like a lower, mid-ranged bar or gymnastics rings that you can work with horizontal pulling from. We kind of filling gaps with this with certain other movements. But again, I didn't want to make, as useful as the gymnastics rings are as an upper body development tool, in many cases, someone who is sedentary is not always right in the position to go and buy a set of gymnastics rings and start hanging them up in their house. And I know it's a small ask to ask someone, hey, can you get gymnastics rings? But I wanted to keep the programming as minimal as possible in terms of equipment. Yeah, so we work with vertical pulling progressions, horizontal pushing progressions, but we do also incorporate locomotion. Locomotion in terms of just moving the body through space. Again, this helps contribute to developing the proprioception of the body, the awareness of the body, how long are my limbs, what structure do I need to make this particular form to try and adhere to this model of a movement that's in this resource. And you then use these tools for mobility development, as well as conditioning as well. So I've mentioned this elsewhere, but locomotion as a tool or as a movement aspect, it changes with your physiological abilities. As your physiological potential changes, it becomes something different. So, for example, a certain locomotion movement for someone in the initial instances of practice, it could really be a strength tool and a conditioning tool, because the mechanics are not as efficient, the pattern is not embodied, and so it takes a lot more out of the practitioner. That's at that point in time. Then their mechanics and also their patterning with these particular movements develops. But perhaps, of course, it takes oftentimes much longer for the mobility aspects to develop. So if we're working with low gait locomotion movements focused around the lower body, then they would still be getting this type of mobility side effect thing coming with it. And then taking them to the further stage, ultimately after some time of practice, where we start looking towards efficiency, actually using that pattern to move efficiently through space. This is a very kind of end type of process with that, using it to move efficiently through space, because there's a lot of other things that are involved in terms of it's like a kind of an expansion beyond the idea of what the programming is actually designed for. I make no pretenses about producing programming and saying you're going to be moving like a gem floating through space in butterfly. No, this is a physical practice program. So whilst there are wider applications for some of the locomotion patterns that I present, I do put them there just as, okay, you're using this as a conditioning tool, or it's being used as a strength development or mobility development tool. And also with pretty much all the programming outside of the breathing and diaphragm, the physical practice programs will also have like movement tasks or movement projects, which are very simple, isolated tasks in the initial instance, mostly focused around, small frame mobility, around fine motor control, also gross motor control, but with more of a sensitivity. And again, not only is this, an important aspect, I think, this kind of like fine motor control idea, it's also then widening the perspective of what is physical practice. It then gives people a space to exercise these qualities, characteristics such as, patience, de-ambition, and things like this through the context of those movement projects. That would be the general perspective of what the program, specifically sedentary workers, would look like.
And it gets me wondering as well how, you're describing on the other side, you've got this like online support, right, which is more individualized. When people come to you for that, is it like, okay, I want to develop a movement practice, or is it more like I want to get, that CC squat? how does how does the conversation normally go? And then how does that normally develop into then, you giving your online support?
There are, I'd say, there's obviously more than like two camps, but there are often two perspectives I get approached with. The first one is normally like, look, I want to do everything, but I don't know how to do it. It's like, okay, we need to kind of rein those pieces in and just construct you with a context of physical practice in which we can attend and look at different movement aspects. You can get a bit of experience in each one, and through that, develop your physiological potential with that as you progress. And then these people would very often, if they just want to have a brief overview of they want me to present my idea of what this generalist practice is, then it would be something like a full practice or the movement practice that we work on.
So what would that sort of look like, because that's so broad, it's like, give me everything, but it's like, can't do everything.
Yeah, no, you cannot. So, I mean, as I mentioned with the sedentary workers, for the process of accessibility and also familiarity, with the sedentary workers, for example, like I mentioned with locomotion, I will, for example, have a lower body section, and then the locomotion will be geared towards low grade and lower body complexity, which is an idea always kind of pondered over. And I still use this perspective of we have a core practice in there, which is upper body strength and mobility and lower body complexity. Would be the core of like the online support programming if you were taking a complete practice, as opposed to people just taking individual modules like only handstand, only floor communication. But for example, the upper and lower body, depending on the person, it could be mostly locomotion oriented. And we develop upper body and lower body complexity through the aspect and the subject of locomotion, just as much as we can do through the subject of floor contact and floor work. It depends on the practitioner and their background. Sometimes we will look at developing the person to be able to perform really basic fundamental lifts, like for example, a back squat or a front squat. Perhaps the person has never done a deadlift in their life. I have a friend who was, I was said to him, I was doing some climbing. I was like, oh yeah, after doing some climbing, I've just started doing a few sets, revisiting the bench press. And he was like, I've never done a bench press before. Like, wow, man. It's not like necessarily a fundamental tool for everyone, but as a context to experience, like, check it out. You need to visit bench press. It's fine. It's good, nice context. So in some cases, I will, put certain movements in there or develop people to be able to perform those movements safely with an eye of that being their exploration. It's not you must do deadlift or bench press or front squat in order to keep your physical capacities in check. It's like, no, if you've not explored it, it will be a valuable place to explore for all the ups and downs it will bring for you during the learning process.
I like that, because sometimes, especially if you go on Instagram a lot or go on YouTube, you start seeing like a lot of the commonalities of what's being recommended, right? Like, especially this phrase, bang for buck, do this one because it covers heaps of areas. And then you almost feel like then there are certain tools that start getting elevated above all others and prioritized as well to a lot of different people. But I like how you're saying, say with the bench press, which might be almost getting demonized by the, that sort of barbell work by the movement crowd is worthy of also being explored just for that experience of exploration.
Definitely. And this again is, my perspective. I think there's always something that is very easy to forget or perhaps not to recognize is the history of physical practice, and by which I'm referring now more to performance development, which I would kind of then rephrase into developing your physical movement potential as an expansion of that, from my point of view, where I like to go. So looking at this kind of training, perhaps environment, we can call it, it has always been rooted in the perspective of progress. And now many people might think, well, of course, that's what training is. Is it? Does it have to be? Because if I'm practicing, I'm going to improve anyway.
as long as I'm not doing something that's completely just, this is a complete waste of time. If I'm doing a movement in a particular way over a long period of time and investing in it, and it's just really an inferior movement in terms of what I am trying to do with it. So let's say, for example, I want to increase my overall strength capacity and I choose a barbell curl instead of a deadlift. Then we can say in that context, there is a better tool to be used. However, if as part of that entirety of strength exploration, I then incorporate these other elements, of course they have a space because it's part of your exploration of that movement subject. So in some cases, the programming that I provide, it can be seen as, what people might say, it's like quite varied and quite mixed. By mixed, I don't mean like just mixed up. I mean like there's a lot of different aspects in there. But it's always programmed with a very practical, background of programming understanding to the extent that my programming knowledge goes. And it's never, just random. It's not that, oh, let's go and explore this today. It's like, no. It's all designed to contribute to one idea, but I try not to, in myself, and also what I share with people, always have the perspective that everything needs to contribute towards progress. This has been talked about in other, philosophies and other intellectual circles about, what this ultimately leads to and the benefits and drawbacks of always having even the idea of, that we just moving forward, one on top of the other. This also ties in with the idea of the lateral perspective and the lateral progression that goes with that. And, one very simple analogy I like to use, just because, I used to love these type of role-play video games when you get your XP and things like this. I love the Mass Effects, and the Jedi Knights and stuff, the BioWare things. So you develop XP over time in your experience with the game. How you choose to spend that XP and the path you choose to go is up to you. Do you want to be the sniper? Do you want to be the power guy that shoots the rockets? Do you want to be the sleuth? Do you want to be the wizard? This is your practice. And normally through online support is me, first of all, judging, does this person want to be a wizard, or are they more trying, because very often they don't know themselves, right? So when people then go to something like the movement practice, this is then what I'm trying to cultivate along the way in conjunction with them, changing as they change through their practice and their life changes as well with everything that comes with it, adapting, but kind of cultivating, whatever it is that they're working on, whatever path that they're following, changing if necessary, cutting, sidetracking where appropriate, and not just kind of, we need to go forward, keep getting it, just keep repeating it. Because this pays a toll, not just physically, but also then psychologically as well. I think that is also something that's very, very important. So yeah, with a movement practice, if someone comes to me and says, okay, I just kind of want to do everything, but I would first of all start with this basic format that I have, which is upper body strength and mobility, lower body complexity. Then one of their programming would be floor communication. And then floor communication is, for me, it includes or can include locomotion, bipedal locomotion, quadrupedal locomotion, floor contact movement, even some things like types of florodeo work from the world of capoeira, working with these types of movements that was shared in more of a training format by, for example, Ida Botal, and made it very accessible to people. And pieces that I learned from my own very brief explorations in these areas. And then, of course, things like the movement projects that are available for them to explore too. And there's always, a priority. We work on the spine as well. I encourage people to have their spinal work, separate to what they're kind of learning. At some point, it would be incorporated into their programming. But first of all, we try to establish a basic vocabulary of different directions of waving, of rolling, ultimately to types of expression as well. But again, this depends on the practitioner, because, for example, if someone, I don't mean this in the bad way, I say doesn't have the patience or hasn't had the time perhaps to look at more isolated movement projects, things that might seem stupid from the outside, like balancing a ball on your head, touching the back of the head to the floor. We're working with a tennis ball on the foot. If the availability and the resources are not available in them to spend the time to complete these tasks, we will not then move forward to what might be called, the more juicier tasks when we're working with things like tennis balls for timing or rhythm and coordinative tasks and arm patterns, and then growing into further things. I mean, there's many resources I have that I have yet to share with anyone. I've only been really running the online platform as a full-time thing for about a year. It was running a year before that as well, but just a side project with a few people. And so there's still places to be explored by the practitioners who are in the program, which kind of excites me quite a lot. But those are available to whether you are working with the whole movement practice, or whether just the core practice, the upper and lower, and something just added on.
With the lower body, a lot of people would talk about like lower body strength or mobility, and you've termed it lower body complexity. What do you define under this label of lower body complexity?
Yeah, so it came from the perspective that the lower body can be complex. And complex, not as it's really complicated. Complex is that it can do complex things. It was inspired by, again, something that Ido Portal mentioned in a workshop some years ago. The idea, he may have mentioned it in a video as well, that the upper body craves complexity, hence the greater range of motion of the shoulders, hence the gymnastics being a tool of a tool, and then the hips crave intensity. So it might be more accurate, I think he may have said, of course, paraphrasing, but the shoulders crave complexity, and the hips or they crave intensity. And of course, there is also then room to apply that to say that the lower body can also be complex. So complex in terms of being able to perform patterns, just like you might perform patterns with the arms. And this is a hugely, unexplored. I've explored a lot of this idea of lower body complexity in relation to contact with the ground. So essentially kind of closed chain with some open chain work. But then, of course, we have this whole world of, open chain leg movement that is explored very much in the world of, for example, like contemporary dance. You would see it, the ballerinas, they're lifting their legs up and swinging them around the head. This is a different world, a specialized world. But this as well, the movement of the legs in space. Martin Kilbady, also, I think he wrote this one time on Facebook, just a note. What if the legs could move like arms? And, it's true. Like, what if, how many of us are practicing to try and move the legs like arms in space as a point of, exploration, investigation, and research? So lower body complexity for me was also quite a convenient, easy way to then transition many individuals who were coming towards the idea of a movement practice. And in most cases, the lower body has been relegated to, a powerhouse of strength. And that's what it's for. The wheels, right? With bodybuilding, we talk about the wheels. Well, what can a wheel do? You can roll, and you can change direction. Okay, but can it fold? Can it turn inside out itself? Can it twist? It becomes very difficult if you've built your wheels just on the idea of them being a steam engine. And I was a high proponent of this idea because that is exactly where I came from. I spoke previously about when one of the practitioners in the program was speaking about doing this. How long would it take me to do a dragon pistol squat touchdown shoulder to the floor? And like, look, 2012, when I first visited the pistol squat, I was doing pistol squats on 2 breeze blocks stacked on top of each other with wraps around my knees, not able to squat on one leg below 90 degrees. So I was very familiar with having a set of wheels or legs that did not have complexity. And when I started digging more, it started quite simply with unilateral leg strength, and then digging more into mobility work, and then effectively then looking at patterns that I could make, working the way into locomotion to moving the body through space and thinking, wow, these are pretty complex things that I'm standing on here. So hence, for that reason, to open the perspective of many that perhaps had a more familiar background of less complexity with the lower body, to start looking at potential. And for that reason, it's like, it could be called the potential complexity of the lower body, but it's just lower body complexity.
Yeah, I really like how you describe it, and that message that you're sending out there, because I do feel that sometimes the legs are treated in that way, like very almost linearly, and it's emphasized in that way. What's your take on this notion of practicing efficient movement patterns versus practicing for inefficiency?
How would you define those two terms yourself? Just as you're presenting the question, like to be inefficient or efficient. So,
maybe in the context of this discussion, there's sometimes there's always an emphasis in terms of like a technical way to perform something. Even like say handstand, right? The straight line, or there's like for a planche, people are saying like the protraction in this certain way with the slight external rotation cue, and that's like the best way to develop the planche, because for whatever reason it's like efficient for this shoulder complex to organize itself to biomechanically support the whole body weight. But and maybe inefficient would be if somehow you can do it, but then it's like kind of retracted and doesn't look like what the Instagrammers are looking like.
Okay. Yeah, I would just, not to like dig your words around and stuff, but just for me, because inefficient and efficiency means something different, and a really nice idea, which is maybe something we can come back to, the perspective. I touched on it briefly about with the locomotion, how like for me, just briefly, with efficiency and inefficiency, inefficiency is when you are unable to perform a movement for one reason or another, for a lack of mobility, for a lack of strength, in such a way that is performed with ease, at which point it becomes efficient, and at which point normally it starts to stop serving you, actually. So inefficiency is actually a tool that can be used. When you're struggling with this pattern, you're very inefficient, and then you develop certain physical attributes and qualities that then bring you to efficiency, but then I'm efficient at it now, so it doesn't really give me so much. So this is more kind of my idea of efficiency and inefficiency. So I would think of this more in terms of like, I guess more like tell me if I'm barking up the wrong tree, but like more of a technically correct way to do something, and then perhaps a suboptimal way of essentially not doing the movement quote unquote correctly. Is this kind of the dichotomy that you're looking at?
Yeah, maybe let's dig down this rabbit hole.
Yeah, cool. So I mean, again, it's always context dependent. So let's use the example of planche. You want to learn how to do a planche. There are certain progressions, certain forms that are most definitely more conducive to you after consistent application, and with the accessory work around it, to not really fuck yourself up like I did in the past, that will get you there at a certain point in time, some unforeseen time down the road, when your practice is continued for a sufficient amount of time. So in this case, if that is the context, you want to learn planche, or for example, you want to get a double body weight back squat, or a triple body weight deadlift, look and take advice and techniques from the people who have done or are doing it. This is obvious, right? We know this. And whatever techniques, everyone of course will have different techniques, different things, but your research into that, and then your application on yourself to try and error for your form, for the different nature of your joints, what is more weight bearing, what is not. Everyone's going to be different in these regards. Tweak and adjust accordingly through your knowledge of looking into this specific movement context. There will be a certain form that is not only more conducive to you getting that movement, but I would venture to say, if it is a valuable movement, so not just like I want to do some wrist flexion or something, the most technical way to do that is like if it's a planche or if it's a back squat. If you learn how to properly back squat, this is going to be transferable to many other types of strength movement contexts. If you learn how to have a certain form, an optimal form, to perform a planche, this is going to be very transferable to something like a handstand push-up. If, however, you do somehow manage to, get a full planche without something like scapular protraction, and the intention of, I'm not saying you have to be hollowed out to the point that you look like you're in a reverse bridge, but the intention is there and that's what you're working. I mean, first of all, I'd be very, very surprised to see that happen. Like if someone was holding a planche and they were like, yeah, I'm pulling my shoulders back and holding it, I'd be like, wow, really? Is that what you're doing? Yeah, so short of that as well, it wouldn't be transferable. I mean, what now can I use that for? I've just learned something with a form that, at some point biomechanics do come in, that they're useful in the extent of looking at essentially just physics. Something like, it's something I often mention when people learning fundamental support movements, such as like Achilles hands, and you're supporting yourself on the floor with a horizontal support. Or even like progressions for handstand push-ups, like working with a pike push-up or something like this. But the elbows are, severely slanted towards the ground. It's like, this is not, by the laws of physics, this is not a strong support. A strong support for a horizontal load is going to be a vertical support. This is why when you see, scaffolding, it's not like, all this way. They will have X's, but they would be supported by main pillars. So, of course, in this way, these certain technicalities, the correct way to do something is most definitely, going to be useful, at least having knowledge of and having a fundamental application of for a certain amount of time. There then does, the context then changes. So for example, if you then want to transition in and out of certain movements, if you want to do a squat, maybe not a weighted squat, but then you want to go and sit into the ground afterwards and then get back up again, the mechanics do not apply. Try and keep a completely, neutral spine whilst going down into a squat, sitting into the ground, lying down, getting back up again. It doesn't work. But the context has changed. It's no longer the context of maximal weight back squat or whatever it is. It's now the context of get up and down from the floor. That's it. So in these cases, if you were then to look with those same, technical, those technical points from a different context, and then you look at another context and go, oh, there's a squat in there, but it's not doing it, clinically sound. It's like, well, but are they actually doing what you think they're doing? Are they trying to do a back squat? This came up only a couple times, because thankfully the Jefferson curl, for example, the Jefferson curl with the gradual rounding of the spine under load is becoming kind of more common for people to see the benefits for, in the fitness industries and functional fitness as well. But a couple of times I did have in the past, trainers come up to me and go, oh, you don't want to round your back when you're doing that. And, you can stand up and go, well, you're so stupid. You clearly don't know the benefits of the Jefferson curl. Coach Summers and listen to what. No, but it's like, no, it's just because they are approaching it from a different context, and they're not aware that what you're doing is with a different intention. And therefore this cannot apply. So in the case of doing something, correct or not correct, or if it's kind of efficient, it depends upon the context and what you're applying it for. In terms of then perhaps, maybe this is maybe towards what you were thinking in terms of being efficient or inefficient, as in like going out of alignment and things like this. I think this idea was kind of like it became a popular throw around thing, like out of alignment, to just kind of to confront more the idea of, hey, do we always need to work the kind of this linearly? I don't necessarily think for the people that are still chasing it as like, oh yeah, we go out of alignment. I think it's good to kind of step back from that as like we're the out of alignment people, and just taking a softer focus and accepting all the valuable parts that all of it has to offer. This kind of idea of out of alignment, I would just basically just call this prehabilitation. Like the prehabilitation that I provide, which is really closely at some point blends and even merges with my perspectives on mobility. So prehabilitation would then be the idea of exposure to certain ranges that the joints are, biomechanically able to go through, but for some reason or another, whether it's neurological, psychological, physiological, your body cannot or will not go there. such as very common deep flexion of the knee.
Mm-hmm.
Deep flexion of the knee. I mean, we need this. If we go up to down, we go from extended to globally compressed. So globally compressed requires deep flexion of the knee. It's not asking, people to go further than what is biomechanically, just built into the frame that we have. If people then do want to explore more stuff that isn't so in our, our physiological potential, like standing on the hands, these are not built to be stand on, these wrists are not meant to be weight bearing, you can do it. But then the ideas of, going out of alignment and things like this, you will have to go to certain places that practice might take you. If you are using a practice of locomotion, you may also find yourself going, whether as part of the practice or shit just happens, I slip up when I'm in a weird position, there's certain exposure to certain ranges that are essentially for your living functionality not necessary at all. So in this terms of efficiency and going out of alignment, again, there needs to be a dual perspective. The ideas of hierarchy and this is better than this, and we need to just go to weird positions for the sake of it. It was a nice kind of put forward. That's the idea that we're presenting. But now dialogue. Let's get down to the programming. Let's get down to the implementing. How can we actually work this in a way that is when it's appropriate for some people and perhaps not appropriate for other people. So it always comes back to that idea of what is the individual context.
Yeah. And with mobility, I've heard you talk about it in terms of this like large and small frame. Correct me if I'm wrong. What do you mean by these terms?
Yeah, so again, it's not from a sense of like, okay, now we can map it out. This one is small frame, this one is large frame, this one is. It's not like that at all. It's for like, it's more perspective of the idea of mobility. The small frame mobility, it would start with looking at the spine, as in these vertebrae don't really move that much individually at all, and it's only in their combined work together. That the global spine can move and twist in certain spaces and certain positions. So this is kind of small frame. I would also then venture to look at even like finger work or work with the wrists or the ankles and toes as small frame, as a point of programming. Because remember, when I'm presenting a program to someone, it needs to be digestible. So sometimes, this is kind of goes under the idea of small frame. They can think, okay, small things, mobility of this. It helps someone work with that idea kind of more tangibly. Large frame, I center around the perspective of forms, large frame forms, which is essentially what then became the idea of the splits, pancake and bridging program that I released. These are large frame forms, so your front splits, middle splits, various types of bridging, front folding, and things like this. And this is what I would call large frame mobility. And it could also be termed even like local and global. This is a term that was used quite a lot by Carl Paoli in his books that he wrote, perspective of just local and global. So local mobility on these kind of small positions, small kind of articulations, and then with more global forms, Instagram forms, right? So, but one of the important things to forefront with that, and I also forefronted this right at the beginning of the programming for splits, pancake, and bridging, is that even though we are using these global large frame mobility forms as like in the name of the practice, or they're written, it says that's what the name of the movement is, front split, whatever variation it is. It doesn't mean that we're going for that form. That's a personal choice. I'm not going to force someone to get the splits. I'm not going to force someone to get like a back bridge. However, it provides a context within which to develop that, focused on an exploration of a movement context. Rather than, I just want to get a bridge. It's like, no, we'll play around there in a bit. I use this analogy sometimes and people really don't get it. But I'm like, let's just visit Bridgetown for a bit. Let's visit, Middle Split City for a while. We go for a weekend break there. We might just take a whole phase there. And we'll definitely go back because there'll be more to learn when we come back. But unless someone says to me, I mean, if it's integral to their programming, it fits along with it, like certain types of large frame mobility for the lower body are really, really going to help you with your handstand practice. I would keep them there for a point of, furthering that exploration. In some other cases, we might look at some splits development things. And if I look at the person's submission and they're at a decent enough range, I mean, unless they really want to go further, I might even ask, hey, look, we can keep pushing forward with splits development work, or we can tune some of that time towards this other thing. What do you think? And in some cases, people will say, hey, look, in all honesty, like I'm finding front splits a breeze. I'm not really getting much out of it. Can we move to something else? And that's like perfect. We can now use that space to put something else in. And now the practice is developed in line with their perspectives of what they want to explore as well. So yeah, this would be the difference between the large and small frame mobility. Small frame mobility, there's starting with, of course, the spine, and we would use that as just kind of a heading for that subject, and the large frame is more related to the forms that I spoke about.
And recently you've been releasing these videos on proofing on YouTube as well. Can you explain a little bit more about this concept of proofing, and how does that sort of fit within practice? And you mentioned this core practice before as well.
Yeah. So the idea of proofing might perhaps be misunderstood as well. So the most simple way I can present it is proofing is a checking. This is what I mean by like a type of proofreading, like a trial running, checking how it's feeling today. It's a quite simple thing. How do you feel today? So proofing is quite essentially going through the available ranges that you have. But what is often a barrier to this? I mean, someone who is, aware of their movement, has experience with moving certain, had certain frames in which to move their body, like ideas of how they can move the spine, for example, as opposed to someone, you say, oh, you need to move your spine. And they're like, what? How do you mean I don't understand. So when you do have these terminologies and vocabulary that you can express through your body, it can be very easy to proof. I mean, when I post these things, many practitioners said, oh, this is the thing that I like normally kind of do. You've given it a name. And it's like, well, yeah, I think that anyone who develops a certain awareness is aware of certain things. Check that, kind of go through here, across the shoulder. The left one's always the tweaky one. On the neck, it's a bit bent up from whatever. This would be proofing, checking how it feels. So then what I wanted to do with the idea of the proofing series is to go through essentially all the articulations in such a way that was providing very loose contexts through which people can move. And it's kind of, because they're kind of longer length, it's even, someone can sit there and just kind of move around, put the volume up and just kind of do it with it. It does help, as I mentioned in the videos, if you have a pre-established understanding of some sort of patterns and ideas, like certain planes of waves or flexion extensions, really basic vocabulary. But again, if I was only creating it for the benefit of those people who have familiarity with that, it's not going towards what I want to do, which is kind of open these ideas for more people. So the proofing, as it goes through the different parts of the body, it essentially presents contexts such as, for the spine, taking impulses for the floor, moving and being moved, using the body to then move the spine, or using the spine to then affect the body, which for me, when people presented some of these ideas to me, because many of them are also influenced from other people, as it's impossible not to be, thankfully, that when they were presented to me, they provided me with what I have called permissions. Like, oh, I can do it like that. That's like a permission that allows me to do that. So I try to share certain ideas that, okay, so basically I'm working with a shape. So I'm drawing this shape in space, and I'll give you a visualization. This is how you can visualize in order just to move. And this is short of providing specific stage-by-stage programming for certain things. Although I do provide that for people who are in the online support program and also using the standardized programming, But ultimately, there is a second intention behind this idea of giving people context, in which to kind of freely move and check. So there's proofing, there's checking of how they feel. And the second is starting to actually move. And now again, this can sound pretentious, like, oh, actually moving. No, what I basically mean is being able to step away from pre-designated routines and sequences to then start to just move the body in space with some intention. And this is really important, because intention doesn't come for free. By intention, I mean, like, what do you mean to do? And this would then be the difference between, moving through space and actually affecting something and working on something consciously, as opposed to what a friend and teacher of mine has called being drunk on movement, which is nice as well. This kind of ecstatic, just like, this is, it has its place. It has catharsis, but its place in that. But as a point of research and investigation of yourself, and under the perspective of what I'm presenting, which is proofing, it doesn't quite gel. It would be something different. A last kind of tack on from that. So we've got, through proofing, giving people context in which to see how it's kind of feeling today. And the second point would then, that leads them to then kind of just moving through space with some intention. And the third thing would be that it was also an extension for the people who have been practicing with me online after a certain amount of time to get them away from practicing just routines. Like, we can go through a lot of spinal work material. We can work on this for like years, a couple of years. The same as, some other lower body complexity work and squat related stuff. But at some point, just like the hand balancer who is proficient, sometimes it's just enough to and jump on your hands. And it's not necessary that at the beginning of my practice I always do my squat routine. This has its place, most definitely, at a point, at a time. However, at some point, I want practitioners who work with me to be independent of that. So, for example, in some cases, I'm not sure how other people do their online programming. I didn't do like research to see what they're doing, and I just did what I thought would be best for people, and also would gel with me and my perspective as well. So we start off with, a large part of the program is geared towards the idea of prehabilitation. But as I said, this becomes gelled with mobility at some point. So like a third of the programming that day would be like prehabilitation related. But at some point, I want them to take that 15 minutes into their own hands. I want them to use, patterns like the 1990 through moving through space. I want them to start, just checking, being able to proof and see how it's feeling today. And then they might even just throw a song on, put the song on, and I just say, okay, spine proofing, 2 songs. And this is where I kind of like want to take people to a certain point, and because that's essentially where I have gone in my own personal practice. And as I've always said, nothing more, nothing less. The online support program and the programming is a reflection of my experiences. It can be nothing more than that. And I wouldn't try to present anything more than what I've already practiced myself, and is, I believe, valuable to share with other people who come to me for help or to collaborate and things like this. So proofing for me was something that was always there. This idea, I wrote an Instagram post. The first one I think was when I was in Brazil. I was on the beach and I'd been spinal proofing and had this idea in my mind for a while. And it was the same thing. I posted about it and people were like, yeah, this is what I do as well. And I was like, well, it's definitely something that people who are interested in movement and moving the body ultimately do come to. And for those who are kind of approaching that or are unfamiliar with it, I wanted to present a short series, just bringing some insight into that and how I use it and how it works for me.
I like this, kind of guidance to shift away from this structured exercise, right? Because I think it's a challenge as well for teachers, where you offer guidance where people come for guidance, and a lot of it can be very prescriptive, right? It's like, follow this program, do this, do that. But we normally find that as we go deeper into these practices, right, there's this curiosity to explore, to just experience, how the body moves. And I kind of find it a little bit funny that, you then also almost top down instruct them to proof and to creatively explore as well, right? Like do 15 minutes or do 2 songs of it.
Mhm.
So how do you normally see that transformation within that person when then they just do start almost developing this independence, so that concepts like this or exploration like this, you get this sense that they are actually doing this?
Yeah. So also with that as well, with the idea of the prescriptive routines, I think if you develop programming for someone, you're meeting this person for the first time, right? And you're dealing with them physiologically. You should have certain processes in place and certain parts of, like, I'm not saying a standardized program, but what I'm saying is kind of go-to tools that will give you information about how they practice and what's available. So this kind of prescription idea is always very important in the first instance because you're just working with someone. It's also important for me anyway to develop terminology of certain movements, because these are movements that we will continue to use in the future in different varying capacities and interconnectedness. So the prescriptive routine definitely has its place. And of course, there are also people that, they come straight from the fitness world. And I mean, if me, as we mentioned earlier, I see myself as can be an inquisitive person and asking questions, it still took me, only 10 years to get to the point of like starting to question what I was doing with my physical practice because it wasn't in harmony with the rest of my intellectual or whatever type of thinking. So again, I'm not going to throw proofing at someone who is still getting the benefits from a prescriptive practice. So it does most definitely have its place. When I do introduce it to people and when I do incorporate it, it starts very, very slowly. Because again, it's very rare that if someone's been working with me for like less than 9 months or a year, even if they're what might be called a more proficient practitioner with some practice background that helps them a lot, for 2 reasons. The first thing is it takes that long for me to give the certain vocabulary and for me to know that they practice it. Like even if people are like quite proficient with certain things, no, I'll still make them practice the set forms because we need to have this communication through movement. I can't be there and direct you and perhaps do some stuff with you and we can move together. So I need to understand that we both need to understand that when we're working on spinal work, these are some of the things that we've established and they can refer back to them. So I would give proofing then to people who have that, established and understood. With something like squat proofing, I wouldn't ask for a submission. It's their own personal work. I present the idea. There's no kind of right or wrong about it. There are some other more improvised forms. So for example, again, at a certain point when we've established certain locomotion patterns and we have kind of a set view, there are improvisation videos that I have, but restricted to certain forms. So for example, you have, forward lateral bear crawl and, like a crab walk with like a hole, and you can do a high bridge rotation and like a gallop or maybe 6 movements, 2 minutes, record yourself for 2 minutes, please send the video to me. So this would then also be an idea of this more kind of free flow, more open thing. But again, I wouldn't present that to someone until they've gone through the certain patterns in the way that I present them, or else we're just not speaking on the same page. I think that's the whole idea of entering to someone with a collaborative relationship on your physical practice. It's not always, let me see what you can do. It's like, no, we work on something together now. What have you made with the tools and things that I've shared with you? So proofing is not something I would ask for in terms of submissions, but with the idea of, how do people respond to it and how do they take it into their own practice? In many cases, and I know it from watching them, it's like they've been doing it already. So in many cases, again, it's just like I just give them the permission. So when they see the squat routine, or they haven't had a squat routine for a while, they've just been going through like ranges, and then I throw something in like low gate exploration. They know, I can work with my Pubu drop stance. I can start incorporating single leg balances. I can start working, entering and exiting the floor through the low gate position. And I know they'll be practicing it. But at the same time, very often I would just kind of leave it to them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the ultimate, I say the ultimate goal, but essentially what I think is a nice perspective for anyone who offers help for someone. Help is temporary. It's assistance. Assistance is essentially, okay, you can profit from me at the moment through other means. I can profit from you. We establish into a mutual relationship. There has to be elevation on both sides, you know, but at some point it's like, I'm kind of like, just like, don't you have enough programming now? I mean, this is never actually come to this point with a practitioner yet. And I wouldn't just tell someone you're free to fly, but I would kind of, their program would start to evolve in such a way when they would be like, I think I'm proficient to take this on, you know, myself and construct it myself. And, you know, some practitioners who work with me for one reason or another, they have broken off from the online support program, some with the intention of developing it themselves and continuing their own structures. Some have failed. Others have then, in their own way, I've seen them through the stuff that they present online, they're using the tools that I shared with them and they're presenting it to their circle of people in either where they live, in their communities, people they're connected with on their online platforms, and they're able to, you know, share those benefits even further forward. And for me, I you know, in a bad way, I feel pride in the sense of, I'm like, it's so nice that you are now able to reproduce this to another person in your own way. Like, you take it and you take it, and now you're, as from what I can see, also positively affecting other people. And it's like not something, for me anyway, when I enter into something that might be called a profession, would, like, you know, hope for. It's something that is, you know, I don't think you can, if you have an ambition to really do that, you're putting a lot on your shoulders. So for it to happen and have the feedback, and you can see that it's affecting other, it's spiraling across. This is really, really encouraging, and it's it's humbling.
Yeah, it's a really nice validation that, you know, the ideas that you're coming up with and spreading are good ideas, right? Because good ideas spread. I wanted to ask about maybe something recently that you are learning, maybe within a concept or a project framework, and describe maybe your approach to learning something.
Okay. Well, I start with my approach to learning something is, of course, if you really want to dig into it, if it's a really juicy subject, if it's like a whole, you know, movement aspect, like a type of dance or dance in general, with your teacher that you should have, shut the fuck up and listen. Sorry to drop the F-bomb, but it's like, that's it. Even if you think you have something, just be like, act like you're dumb. I know this is weird. Like, I just kind of like, I would just stand and go, okay, even if I'm not sure I'm understanding, if it's something that's really integral to the moment, I will of course ask for clarification. But if I think it's just doubt, just because I haven't come to comprehend it, because I haven't practiced enough yet to comprehend it, so there's no point of them, even if they told me blank in my face and wrote it down on a piece of paper, I would not understand it because I have not physiologically embodied it, not neurologically embodied it. The movement is not in my body. Shut up and just go with it, take it where it goes, let the emotions kind of just happen, try to be very, very engaged, but at the same time, try to soften yourself against all these other things that are coming in. And the context I'm thinking about specifically is learning how to box, which I'm, you know, just, it's like, it's great. I always wanted to learn to box or go to learn boxing because I was deathly afraid of it. Really, like, not afraid, but, you know, curious. But it's I mean, I used to rough and tumble, especially with my older brother. I have an older brother who's always been a warrior in his own way at heart, and he's a warrior in his profession now. He's a fisherman, and if anyone wants to talk about strength, here's one thing I'll tell you: anyone want to talk about strength, shut up about your deadlifts, shut up about your curls, shut up about your lifts overhead, and you're specializing in one thing and being really good at it. Talk to a fisherman who's never stepped in a gym before and just see how much weight he can lift off the floor. My brother goes to the gym probably about, when he can get it, about once in a month. And every time I go to that gym, when I go back to my hometown, the guy comes to me and goes, your brother came in here last month, hadn't seen him for about 3 months, and he just threw 220 kilo on the bar and just lifted it up 5 times. I'm like, yeah, man, because his profession requires him to lift in such a way that builds a type of strength over time that cannot be, equaled with, many of the popular perspectives on strength training today. If you look back to the 1920s perspectives of strength training, it's more in keeping with this type of, the laborer lifting. But sorry, that's a sidetrack. So I completely forgot your question again because I went off on the side. It was
about your approach to learning.
Oh yeah, okay, getting punched in the face, good. So yeah, I go to boxing. I played a lot with my brother with these types of things when I was younger and kind of growing up, but then the strategy and the technicality of boxing, I have a really bad eye for other people's movements. I can sense people's movements when I'm in contact with someone, or if I'm being moved, I can be very, very sensitive and I can respond quite well. This is also why I like the context of Sistema as a martial art practice. I'm still, I don't know, just a couple of years practicing this this idea, I guess. It's not, I don't use it as to learn how to fight. I don't use Sistema to learn how to be effectively combative. I don't really see the value in Sistema as mostly from that aspect. I see hugely other valuable things there from different perspectives. So actually to think about, the combat martial perspective, boxing was something that kind of just made sense. It's the classical Western style of, kicking someone's ass. And I'm very bad at reading people's bodies, whereas in Sistema, I can feel a lot because there's a lot of contact. But now, for example, when I was playing capoeira, I still just found it so difficult to judge when the kick was coming from the left or from the right. I would walk into it all the time, which just tells me that I have just a really bad sense of reading people's movements when in motion, in an unpredictable context. When I'm looking at people's videos and submissions, I can, even when I just see the thumbnail, sometimes I can go without even watching the video. But this is different. This is an isolated context. But when moving in space in a dynamic context, and this doesn't help in boxing. So my nose is still like bruised here. But the one thing I did learn from that context of this idea of also just, just shut up and let it happen is just taking it, trying to learn from the hits. In the beginning, it was like I got hit, but there was no register of why did you get hit. I was too much caught up in the emotion of like, oh my God, I'm new in boxing. And like, I have no idea what's happening. I'm just trying to kind of embody some of the images and sketches that I've seen people move like and what I see from people around me, which comes from the second part, which is look what other people are doing as well. Not like when you're working like this, but when you have a chance to step back, observe how people are moving. Try to register what are the important points. So, one of the things in boxing is, of course, the footwork. So look at the feet. What are the feet doing? How do they connect in relation to the hip? How does it then produce what's happening in the arms? How are they moving through space? How is this person working differently to this? This should be supported with more of a fundamental background in terms of building a knowledge base around the sport or the discipline. I think this is really important, especially like the culture. This is something that I found happen with me in the past when I was practicing these forms of floreo and movements as presented by Ido Portal, completely abstracted from the world of capoeira. And then when I entered the world of capoeira, it was like, oh, okay, yeah, I can't use these at all. I have no context at all. And not only that, I completely have no understanding of the incredibly rich culture and history that comes from capoeira. I have to learn about this out of respect for my mestre and for respect out of the other people who are invested in this. So that would also be something as well. Look through the archives of things, look at classic matches, look for, basic boxing history if you know nothing about it, like I had very little knowledge. Start then maybe looking at, try to find certain YouTube channels that, you believe they're presenting a certain perspective or producing material or helpful things that you believe are of value. And just kind of not like, this is how I'm going to do it, I'm going to follow this thing, but just absorb yourself in it as much as you can. And then more than just, oh, I'm doing a bit of boxing or capoeira, it becomes research. And not in the pretentious way of I'm researching a discipline. So no, you're researching it. You're researching it physiologically. You're researching perhaps there's a psychological side to it that you're reading into as well. You're changing your practice, what you use your media for. Maybe you're now gearing it more towards that type of thing to support that entire practice. So shut the fuck up and like listen, just kind of, okay, unless you're of course really confused and you need to know what's happening. Watch everything you can when the time is available to see what is essentially happening, how people are moving. Can you then just try to mimic and embody that? That's a very useful one as well, the mimic. Fake it, just kind of try to move like that until someone goes, hey, look, it's not, you're not Muhammad Ali yet, just keep it on the ground. Okay, then you get useful feedback. And then the third one would be, of course, the research, which is, quote unquote extracurricular, the history, the culture, and also, techniques and tips or things you could pick up quite easily through readily available resources from reliable sources.
Very nice. I like the summary there. And at what point do you, I guess, move on to something else? Like you're into boxing right now. Are you searching for a particular point or a feeling before you're satisfied and you might move on to something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think the perspective that, again, Ido, who's been a huge influence on me, has said many times is the idea of like, where are the gaps? It doesn't have to be where the weakness is, because weaknesses then suggest that you're trying to build like an invincible mover. This is not a perspective of mine. I'm not concerned with optimum anymore. I don't really care. Like, I just want to just practice. But even this is not 100% true, because there are still things, of course, that you just like, nah, I want to give that some go. Perfectly fine. So I think with this perspective of looking for gaps, just going with that. So for example, the reason I started, looking into like capoeira and like sistema and also, boxing is because I had no experience of the martial arts. None at all. A kid as doing karate. That was it for a few years. And of course, natural, I was lucky to have an older brother who could kick my ass and teach me a lot about street smarts, as Nestor Capoeira would say in his lovely little book, the little book of Capoeira, or the other one actually. But in any case, there's a difference between, my brother isn't hugely intelligent. He doesn't have a college education and things like this, but he'll outsmart you. You better watch out. There's a difference between smarts and intelligence, and both are very, very valuable. So I think looking into martial arts for me was the place that was just uncharted, essentially. And of course, in the grosser context of that, the more macro context, if we take a step back, the subject is actually moving with another person in space. This is the more macro thing, the more huge thing. So moving away from I'm just practicing myself and, I do movement practice drills and stuff, or things, people, classes and friends. But as a practice, like a dedicated practice, I'm not moving with people in space, whether that's one or two or whatever. Narrow that down, because I could have gone to dance, and I did do some things with dance, and but this is something I have to come back to. But I'm actually more inclined to kind of more expressive and express my movements in this way. So it wasn't of such a priority. So then it was then narrowing, okay, it's actually more than martial. I have no experience of balancing or bringing together this kind of dichotomy. It's not a dichotomy, but like we're between fight and play. Same thing. I have no experience to reconcile these two together and help subdue, the very common, social reactions to being affronted in what is generally seen as an aggressive manner. I hadn't confronted these. What do I do when someone punches me in the face and I'm inside, weakling, and I just want to kind of jump back and run back in the corner? You haven't got a choice, man. Like you've got a box. That's it. But even the person just keep going. Keep going. That's it. I mean, I'm going to boxing this morning, and like, in all honesty, I'm often like inside looking for an excuse not to. But this is a good sign. This is a good sign, because it means that every time I go there, I'm confronting something. So for me, this is how I would direct that kind of exploration. And again, as I said, influence from the ideas of Ido Portal, which is, he also said X marks the spot. That was his thing for me. And I knew that boxing was kind of in the peak of those martial arts. I mean, I've rolled a bit in jiu-jitsu, but no experience of anything to kind of speak about to anyone or ever share anything with anyone that I've learned. But I was more comfortable in this scenario. I was okay rolling on the floor. I can keep myself to myself, and my legs are quite mobile and strong, so I can get inside. I can guard quite well. But in the sense of just keeping someone off me in general, standing up and flurry of fists and dodging it and reading the body in such a calculated way so that a turn of the face or a lift of the shoulder is gonna, make or break. Don't have this. So this is where I'm going.
Yeah, nice. I really like that thing of confronting almost like your darkness where it's going to scare you the most. That's almost like the opportunity for the greatest learning, right? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Is there anything that you would share to yourself if you could go back in a time machine at the beginning of your movement journey, tell yourself a message? What would that be?
Yeah, it'd be the classic, but it's the one. Here's the thing. It would be patience. Just be patient. Just be patient. But that's the paradox of patience. You can't learn patience until you've been impatient about it. You have to be. It's necessary. So although I would tell myself that, the words would fall not on deaf ears, but on ears that don't really comprehend. And again, I think, like I said before, that the practice of patience never ends. It would fall on ears that had not really a comprehension of what that actually means. So I think in many cases that is the case. All the things that I would like to share, it would be kind of like, still I would come back and sit here right now and speak to you and go, I know when old Jason told me that then, I think I'm starting to understand what it means. Still not really, but now it's becoming of value. So it would just be a case of, continuing in what that thing that you're doing, because it's going to bring you to a point where you might start to comprehend some of these ideas and apply them for the benefit of yourself and hopefully the others that you work in conjunction with. I mean, anything else kind of more cheesy than that, like, keep going, boy, not really. That, so unfortunately it's not so inspiring what I would tell myself. So that would be the extent of it. I would perhaps emphasize patience, and the reason behind that is namely injury. I have injuries that do last a long time because of essentially just impatience. And one thing actually, maybe more practical, that I would share with myself, which is something that then the person could, or myself could then take on and apply, is the idea of research more. Because I was practicing physically a lot in my early stages of building certain capacities and physical potentials that are the things that I think some people get attracted to my work for today. Like, oh, wow, this guy's really mobile, or shows strength in certain contexts, or blah, 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 or moves however. A lot of that foundation was built in a time where I was grinding on an island by myself for a year. So like the type of stuff that should only really be done for like 6 weeks or 12 weeks and then take a deload week, you speak to me then, I'd be like, what's a deload week? And then this is, if I'd researched a bit more, if I had a bit more information, but I just had a certain set of tools, and I was like, I'm going to drill just these tools. And they were, as we said before, they were these types of tools that were the optimal tools to get the job done. But because of my poor choices, and I hadn't researched, and a failure to see what happens in not so far in the long term. I paid the price, and I'm overcoming some of those things, but some of those things will stay with me, and that's my movement path.
Very nice. I like that one with the second edition, because I'm sure if you just said patience to your younger self, you'd end up very frustrated.
No, exactly. Yeah. And again, it comes hand in hand, right? I mean, patience is frustration management as well. It's one of the most common things that comes along. And it's a thing that I see as well, the danger on the far-reaching side of frustration management when it's unable to be applied is disassociation. You kind of break off, and like, you know, the classic British phrase would be, "Oh mate, I can't be dealing with that." Like I can't be dealing with that, mate. It's just that's too, I can't do it. So, and this is not productive for any type of practice. So, you know, managing that frustration through the time is part of what brings the patients ultimately those experiences of going through those individual scenarios.
So, final question. Just like to ask you what's on the music playlist currently, because every time I watch a video, you know, heavy UK garage influence I pick up on. So yeah, just love maybe what's a few top songs at the moment that get you going during your practice.
Heavy UK garage. Someone needs to do the research of British music. Yeah, joking with you. Yeah, I listen to a bit of garage, but no, it's drum and bass. It's my passion. It's my my poison. Drum and bass is a fantastic tempo of music, 170 to 175 BPM. It's great skipping music. It's a type of music that has been called the bastard child of electronic music, because actually people who like house and people who like techno and things like this very often don't gel with it, because it's actually not the same family. It's metal music. Actually, it's metal music then played with, you know, through electronics. Of course, that's a crude, you know, reduction, because the genre itself spans wide and hugely. And as a fan of drum and bass, as a passionate, you know, a practitioner of like mixing drum and bass as well, is that I would say, yeah, look, you just haven't found the drum and bass that's right for you. So there's this kind of this perspective on it. But the music itself, it's like if you go to a drum and bass gig, it's full of energy, whether that's emotional energy, if it's even people crying, for example, or if it's people, you know, going off their nut and raving. There'll always be like metalheads there as well. They can gel with it. So this is one reason why I mentioned, put that out there, where drum and bass stands. And in terms of on my playlist right now, there's a really, really wonderful LP released recently by a Belgian producer who is UK based at the moment, called Alex Perez. If you're interested in drum and bass and a range spectrum of drum and bass, he's the type of guy that if you listen to one of his tunes and you're like, oh man, I can't listen to that. And then you listen to another tune, it sounds like it's not from the same guy in terms of the subject matter and the feeling of the music. Yeah, he just released a new LP, so you can cop that if you're into drum and bass. It's more on the liquid, soulful side, very deep, very rolling. This is the music that I will put on if I ever release a video. And for example, I'm like, you know, doing some weird stuff. Very often, I'm dancing on the music with that. So this is just one thing. Alex Perez, his new LP. Also, I do like personally really atmospheric music. My partner hates it. Like come in and then it'll be this kind of like if you ever played the game Mass Effect, like kind of space effect. I use this a lot. For me, it's really, really powerful. Mongolian throat singing. I also favorited a couple albums related to Mongolian throat singing recently that again have been really, really useful in my practice. I mean, even if you look on my on my Spotify, I have like 3 main types of music, and I just name them. Like, for example, the main kind of, if I want to get something moving, pumping, a bit of energy, would be the chimp tunes. If I need something kind of more easygoing, something more explorative, something softer, something with more emotion, that would be the bonobo ballads. And then the third playlist, which would be the more atmospheric side, if I'm kind of doing, you know, concentration things or just standing practice or whatever, would be the Affe Atmos. So Affe is ape in German. So just a bit the Affe Atmos. So these 3 different playlists kind of represent the types of music I involve in my practice. But the most recent one in terms of, you know, my favorite, which is drum and bass, would be the new Alex Perez EP.
Awesome. I'm gonna go check them out and get myself a musical education.
It's a niche, so you can be forgiven.
Yeah. So yeah, for anyone who's listening, they want to go check out what you're about. dig in a bit more, maybe send you a message, what's the best way?
If you're on social networking and you use like Instagram, send me a message through Instagram. I pretty much always reply to the Instagram messages when they're not like these kind of trying to promote something or like just the profane ones. And I reply. I'm normally quite quick, but I mean, I think acceptable turnaround time is applied there. Some people message me through Facebook. I don't really use Facebook so much anymore. And YouTube as well. For example, people who are watching this and you are working on programs that I provide, very often people say, once I get the programming, do I like have your support? And there's two answers to that. Do you have my one-to-one support? No, because that's not what you're engaged in. You're engaged in a standardized program. Do you have my feedback? No, because again, feedback is when you submit me videos and I give you points and things like that. However, questions and queries on the movements and how it feels for you, you just write it in the comments on the YouTube video for the benefit of all using that program, and I will reply on that. I reply on all the comments on the YouTube videos because I'm not the type that gets like thousands and thousands. So fortunately, it's manageable and I can give like some extensive feedback to people. So if you're looking at videos on the channel, feel free to message something on there. Again, if it's profane or weird, I'll just delete it. So yeah, you can do that as well, but it'll just get deleted. And through the website, it's also possible to get me. So anything that's related to working together or just learning more specifically about my perspectives and a bit of a story if you're interested in that type of thing. That'll be the website, which is MoveMore MP for movementpractice.com. And then you can find all stuff on that there, like the online support and the programs and things. And if there's anything specific, there's the links in the Instagram tree that I put in there. If it's like, oh, I just watched this video, normally I'll put the link in there. So it's also a way you can contact or connect through that as well.
Awesome. Well, I'll include all those details in the show notes as well. But it was a pleasure to connect and then hear, all these perspectives that I've been reading about for a while and then come out from yourself, and I really, really enjoyed that, and I can't wait to listen back on it again, and I just want to say thank you.
Hey, no, thank you very much as well. As I mentioned before we started recording, on a practical level, unless there are people who are engaging with the material that I produce, engaging with the work that I do and the things that I try to share, there is no community, there is no purpose. So I always try to express my thanks to people who do connect with me in any way. It's all part of my practice as well, working with other people in the different calibers, and also yourself for giving an opportunity to be able to share some of the stuff that I just can chat on and on about, or on a platform where people can listen to it quite conveniently and not have to read reams of text or something else. So thank you very much as well.
Episode 28, guys. That was Jason Round. I really appreciate him jumping on, sharing his perspective, sharing his time for us. I got a lot out of that. I've been reading his posts for a while. He shares a lot through his writings and then also through his YouTube channel. I'll put the links in the show notes. I do recommend that you check them out. They are very, very, very good resources, both balancing the sort of high-level philosophy that sometimes comes with this whole movement culture, but also with a lot of practical tips on how to implement that into your practice. So please check that out. And thanks once again to you guys for always sticking around, showing your support. I do really appreciate that. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, hit me up. You can find me on Instagram at Phaon P, that's at PHAONP, or you can also find my details on the website, that's www.thepassivehang.com. And thanks once again for your support. Please, if you enjoyed it, share it with a friend. Otherwise, I will see you guys in the next episode.